All right, I'm going to move this over here. How's everybody doing this morning? Excited to talk about DevOps at 9 a.m. So yes, thank you for the introduction. My name is Jason Hand, and I am a developer or a DevOps evangelist at VictorOps. For those of you not familiar with VictorOps, it is an on-call management, incident management service. I'm happy to talk to you about that in the hallway or later on today. But today, I want to actually first off sort of encourage you to take to the Twitters and move the conversation there. I'd love to hear your feedback. I'd love to hear your questions. We'll definitely have some questions at the end or some time for some questions. But feel free to engage me on Twitter. I love talking to people on there, mostly because it allows everybody to be a part of the conversation. It's cool to just grab me in the hall, but I bet the questions you have or the comments that you might have, other people are going to find useful. So moving that into a common space like social media, I think is great for that. Today, we're going to talk about the DevOps philosophy. So I go to a ton of events. I think I've been to like 6 DevOps days this year, with 5 or 6 more yet to hit before the end of the year. I go to all kinds of just different conferences that are related to web operations and DevOps in general. And over and over and over again, the idea of empathy comes up quite a bit. And so I felt like, there's plenty of people who talk about this, but we've never really specifically framed it in terms of DevOps and what it is that we're trying to accomplish with all of this. Now, I'm going to say here early on in this presentation, there's going to be a lot of quotes. In my research, I found all kinds of really cool stuff that I thought really applied to what we're trying to accomplish as software development professionals and that kind of thing. But I just want to say we'll get through some of these quotes. It's not going to be all quotes, I promise. But a lot of these, I think, really sort of speak to what we do and what it is we're trying to accomplish. And when it comes to philosophy in general, kind of like the DevOps movement, I feel like it really forces us to ask questions about ourselves, what it is we're trying to accomplish, how we're interacting with people, and that kind of thing. How do we frame the world that we live in? And to what degree do we actually care about the things that we do and the people that we interact with and who we're doing it for and why we're doing it in general at all? I recently, as I was sort of researching some stuff for this talk, I came across this book. It was like a $2.99 book or something on Amazon that had 600 quotes that were related to empathy, altruism, and compassion and all that kind of stuff. And I sat there for probably like 3 hours just thumbing through the whole thing. And I promise I'm not going to have all quotes here, but I wanted to put just a few more on here. The point is really that we've been sort of, as people, talking about the idea of compassion and empathy and altruism for a really, really long time. Even with the golden rule, the ethic of reciprocity, it's just something that we've sort of been ingrained into what we do to just be better people and to get along and to sort of grow and prosper. Here's a really just basic definition of empathy. In fact, I think it's it's a little bit too basic. But I wanted to give you just a little bit of background or history on just the term empathy in general. So in 1904, I found out, Wikipedia is awesome for things like this. In 1904, there was this lady by the name of Vernon Lee, and she came up with this term called Einfühlung, and I'm sure my German's not really that good, but close enough. And Einfühlung just essentially means feeling into. And then, a few years later, we kind of have this, or we've got this Englishman who uses, our Greek stuff here to figure out that actually what we can do is call that empathy. And what ended up happening is that the term empathy now is what Einfühlung means. And so that's just a little bit of history about the term. And I guess what I'm trying to point out or highlight here is that even though we've been talking about these different ideas, the word empathy itself didn't actually start showing up into our vernacular and into our vocabulary until the early 1900s. Also, look at that guy's glasses. How are they staying on his nose? So again, as I was sort of researching some stuff for this talk, I came across this really cool video. There's a psychiatrist, sort of a modern psychiatrist, who talks a lot about empathy. And as you can imagine, empathy is something that's very important to sort of the psychiatric field and how we help with all kinds of things, depression and just sort of helping people in general grow and understand life. And she pointed out that there's 4 key parts. And the first one being that you have to be able to see the world as others see it. So it's not just, this is sort of like putting yourself in their shoes. You actually have to take it to that level. The next part is that you need to be non-judgmental. Third, we have to be able to understand another's feelings. So it's not just a matter of saying that I hear you, I understand how that goes. You actually really do have to truly understand their feelings. And then last, you need to communicate those feelings back to that person. I'm not so sure about the importance of that last one, but in fact, there's a whole Reddit kind of going off on a different tangent as to whether or not that's important to this whole argument here. But I do like this last quote that Brene Brown has, and that's empathy fuels connection and sympathy drives disconnection. And I think what she means here is that sympathy is easy. It's easy to display sympathy. Someone could lose their dog or whatever, and you could say, "Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. Can I buy you a beer or something?" But unless you've owned a dog and lost a dog, you really can't empathize with that person. You really can't get to the same type of level as them. Okay, so what does that have to do with DevOps? What does any of this have to do with why we're here today? And also, I need to give you just a little bit of a warning here. There's a really great quote that gets tossed around quite often at different DevOps Days events, actually all over the place, by this guy named Johnny Vincent. And this comes off his blog, which, by the way, I've got links at the very end of my deck here to all of this stuff. But basically, John says, DevOps means giving a shit about your job enough not to pass the buck. This gets shared all the time. Along with, actually further down into his blog post, you'll see this one as well, which I think actually is the one that most people get a chuckle out, because as just raw as it is the truth. We really do have to work with each other. It's no more that we're just kind of siloing each other off with all of these different specialized teams that rarely interact with each other. And that's exactly how it used to be. We used to have our developers, and we used to have our operators, or operations. And they were completely siloed off between, on different sides of the wall, on different sides of the shitty wall here. And so this was sort of how life was. I have to give my friend Steve Pereira credit for this, because he used this GIF at DevOps Days Chicago, and everybody was like, yep, that's exactly how it is, or exactly how it was. But now DevOps is here, right? And so we're moving away from that stuff. And a lot of it has to do with empathy. There's a guy named Pete Cheslock, which if you're not sure who that is, you should look him up on Twitter. He's got a great blog and talks a lot about this stuff as well. And Pete here says, empathy allows software makers and operators to help each other, deliver the best possible functionality and operability on behalf of their customers. And then there's another guy. I swear this isn't all quotes. There's another guy named Jeff Cessna who's big in the DevOps community as well. And we're going to come back to this a little bit later, but what Jeff's trying to point out here is that empathy doesn't really start with just the internal conversations. Empathy is not just about understanding and having this empathetic feel for either developers or the operators or operations or whoever it may be. You also have to have this empathy for your customers and your users. You have to know what it is that they want and truly sort of put yourself in their shoes, because honestly, that's what we're trying to solve for. We're trying to design things that solve their problems. And if you can't put yourself in their shoes, how are you ever going to really design something that helps them? We'll come back to that in a little bit. Here's the thing. Give a shit. Give many shits. Give as many shits as possible. This is what it boils down to. You have to really care. We can sympathize with someone we know, but we empathize. When we empathize, we understand. So, think about what does it take to be a contributing member of a team, and how can you be better and be a better teammate and just be a better person to everybody that you're working with. If you follow DevOps at all, you've probably seen this acronym, the CAMS model, which was sort of come up with by Damon Edwards and John Willis, both of who run this really great podcast called the DevOps Cafe, which I encourage you to check out. So let's go through those real quick for those who aren't familiar with the CAMS model. First one is just culture. And I'm not talking about the fact that we have to have good culture in order to do DevOps. It's really that we're creating a culture of all these other things. So culture certainly is important, and every company is going to have a different culture, and we're all sort of really trying to build a good culture. But it's not that you just have culture and that's step one of DevOps. But what you're doing is you're building a culture of automation. And so what's a first example of an automation I can give you? Well, configuration management. Obviously, that's one thing a lot of people are starting to do. They're using things like Chef and Puppet and Ansible and Salt and whatever to really script out and just be able to automate the provisioning and the configuration of their infrastructure. Alongside with that, you can automate your environments, your platform environments, things like Jenkins and Travis, and testing as well. So automating as much as possible is sort of the idea here that we're trying to find. And by automating these things, we can now not only move on to something else that's a little bit more, thought-provoking, or one of those things that we've been wanting to do forever, but we just haven't had time because we're spending, hours on end each day just performing the same routines. Automate that stuff, and then you can move on to something else. Measurement. This one's actually a big one. We hear all the time, monitor all the things, which there's certainly nothing wrong with monitoring all the things, but actually there's a little bit more to it. There's a guy named Jason Dixon who runs Monitorama. If you're into monitoring and you're into like all that kind of stuff, I definitely encourage you to check out Monitorama, or at least watch the videos from it, because there's a lot of great talks on there. But what Jason likes to point out is that it's not just about monitoring all the things. It's actually about collecting all the things. And the reason why you want to collect all the things is you need that context. You may not necessarily want it as it's happening. In fact, it's not all that useful to just sit around and stare at dashboards and look at all the different things that you're monitoring. But it is useful when something goes wrong, or when maybe you're doing some sort of monitoring-driven development. You're going to need that context when you need it. So you want to be able to at least collect it all, especially when it comes to incident management. Having that context is super helpful. Not only in the moment when you're trying to solve for the problem that's taking down your infrastructure, but also later when you get to the post-mortem phase. To sort of further a little bit on that is this idea that the context is really great, but if you're getting these alerts that doesn't have that context, if you're in charge of your infrastructure and all of a sudden you're being paged about something and you don't have that context, it's really not that useful. A little bit further on to the measurement side of things here is that we're not just talking about monitoring our infrastructure and that kind of thing. You actually want to be able to measure everything that you do. Even myself as an evangelist, I try to measure all of my activities. That way I can get this continuous feedback for me to understand what's working and what isn't. And then I can take that back and I can iterate on that and say, well, this one didn't work out, this plan didn't work out so well, so maybe let's try this. And the only way to really understand whether or not you're headed down the right path is to actually keep track of what's going on, so measure that stuff. And that's going to help us with this idea of continuous improvement, which is really what we're all after anyway. The next item in the acronym there is sharing. Sharing is one of the, to me, maybe one of the most important ones, or at the very least, maybe step one in a lot of cases. So being able to communicate what's taking place constantly, I think helps a lot of teams really start down this DevOps path. Traditionally, we're sort of used to keeping to ourselves. We communicate mostly maybe via email or instant messenger, things like GChat. But we sort of don't, although we feel like we're communicating, we're not really communicating as best as we can. And that increased sharing allows us to increase the feedback and then remove bottlenecks. And then sort of as a side benefit of this sharing, this allows us to teach people not just about what's going on and what my day-to-day life looks like and how you can empathize with me, but also how do other things get done within the company. But wait, there's more. So the CAMS model is pretty popular, but there's also a lot of people like to add an L in there. Sometimes they intend it to mean learning, other times they intend it to be lean. I figured, for this talk at least, learning is definitely worth mentioning. And the point is that we're constantly learning from each other. And that's going to help us with this continuous improvement and this idea of empathy. If I understand to a deeper level what it's like for my developers or someone even on my marketing team to do their normal things, I can now appreciate that a little bit better. And I can learn from all that stuff. We also want to learn from our users and our customers, like I mentioned earlier, some stuff that Jeff Sussna brings up all the time. So why is empathy so important? Well, empathy allows you to view other teams really more as enablers rather than blockers. And so what ends up happening is you have these highly cross-functional teams rather than your silos. You can't get through a DevOps talk without seeing a picture of silos, I promise you. But this is what we're sort of after, and I don't know if this is something that's really taken off just in the last 5 to 10 years, because more and more of us are starting to sort of accept this idea that sure, we can be specialists, but I also want to be a specialist over here, or at least want to have an influence in this over here. And so what we're now starting to see, a lot of this because of the DevOps movement and empathy, is that we're building this this ability to have a greater influence in all things that have to do with software development. So now, me as a developer, I actually really understand how infrastructure works, and if I wanted to, I could actually deploy infrastructure myself. So rather than really sort of relying on those specialists to do that type of thing, I can do that as a developer, which is super important when it comes to developing my software. If I need to, my own development environment, I don't have to wait for operations to build that for me. Something else you have to keep in mind, I'm an evangelist, and you can sit up here and say, oh, well, that guy's just going to run his mouth and try to get us to buy whatever he's selling, and that's certainly something that's out there. I will say that DevOps isn't really something that you can buy. We've got a lot of great vendors and sponsors out here, myself included. I go to a ton of events, and all of those companies and those tools and those services, super important, super valuable. You have to have that stuff. But you can't go out and buy VictorOps or buy whatever and all of a sudden be doing DevOps. It just doesn't work that way. Same way with hiring. I get probably, 10 a week, interested people on LinkedIn wanting to know if I'm, looking for a new job. We've got this amazing DevOps engineer opportunity for you at X company. And I think that there's maybe some confusion either between the recruiters or maybe this company that we just need to hire a DevOps engineer and suddenly we're doing DevOps. It doesn't quite work that way either. Of course, you can hire a DevOps engineer and you can hire somebody who knows how all of this stuff works, but that doesn't mean that on day one of their employment, you're suddenly doing DevOps at a very high level. It just doesn't quite work that way. So, and it's not simply culture. It's not simply automation. It's not just measuring. It's not just the learning. It's actually all of these things. So just keep that in mind. And probably more importantly than the culture and the automation and all that stuff, it's actually more about the people. You have to have people that are interested in doing these types of things. You have to have people who are interested in helping build a culture that facilitates the automation and facilitates the sharing. So it really is more about the people more than anything else when it comes to DevOps. And a lot of this, if you've been paying attention to software delivery or software development over the past 15 years ago, probably this rings a bell. If you've read the Agile Manifesto, you know that step one is that we prefer individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Now, that doesn't mean we don't want good processes and we don't want good tools, but the people and the interactions with those people are actually more important. And that's something that the DevOps movement has definitely adopted from Agile. Okay, so all that's good and well, but where do we start? Well, my suggestion is actually to communicate everything. I feel like the sharing part of it and just telling everybody on your team or actually in your entire company what's going on is actually step one to really getting things moving. And we have this saying in our office that it's actually Slack or it didn't happen. If you use Slack or HipChat or whatever, but the point is, if it's not mentioned in chat and everybody doesn't know about it, it really isn't relevant. Now maybe that's a little bit extreme, but the point is if I'm talking to somebody in the kitchen and we have this really great idea and here's our plan, this is what we're going to do, that conversation is completely siloed and completely black boxed and nobody else has any clue what we just talked about or what our plan is. Same goes for email. So we're moving everything into chat, into general chat. And I'm not just talking about instant messengers and things like that. I'm actually talking about things like group chat. And there's this idea of chat ops. So if you're familiar with this term at all, you probably know how this works. And actually, this is a book that I put together late last year. You can download it for free. But the point is really just moving those conversations into group chat. Some other things are maybe doing a daily stand-up. Are you doing a scrum? Well, this is something we've adopted from Agile, and we do this not only in our developers and our operations, but also in our marketing and our sales. Every single day we stand up and we talk about what did we do yesterday, what are we going to do today, and what may be blocking me from getting that done. And what this does is this, by sharing, we're actually helping people learn what's going on, and then that's going to help lead to empathy. Another good thing that you can do is, how many of you are more developers? Raise your hand if you're more of a developer, okay? And operations? Okay, so a little bit more on the developers. This might make you kind of cringe in your seat right now, but this is where things are going. If you really want to have empathy, if you really want to know what's going on in your company, if you really want to make sure that you've checked in your code and now you didn't just cause the whole system to go down and the weekends like in full effect, you need to be on call because you have the most intimate knowledge about what just went onto our production environment. And so if I'm the one who's on call, not a developer, I'm going to get paged, I'm going to look at it, I'm going to say, well, I don't know what's going on here, this isn't my code, but it's clearly something related to the code. I'm going to go out and find you anyway. So now we're putting developers on call. And that's going to help with empathy, I promise you. Just culture. So you've got this idea of blameless postmortems. Who's ever heard of a blameless postmortem? All right, it's big, it's coming. If you haven't already started doing it, I suggest you look into it. What it is really is that we're taking out any idea of blame. It doesn't matter that I'm the one who ran a command from my terminal that just now took out an entire bank of databases. It doesn't matter that, I haven't slept in 3 days because I've been on call for that entire time. We just want to understand the details, the tech-related details, but also the human-related details. And the only way to really get to that is to remove blame. And all of this is really designed to help create an environment that encourages the empathy. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg. I don't know if you guys like my little hidden messages and all the images behind the text here, but there's so many different things you can do. And obviously, I could sit up here and talk about this for hours. Hopefully, these are giving you a little bit of ideas and a little bit of tips. But don't forget that you do have to look outside. These aren't just things that we're trying to build internally. Of course, we need to build empathy internal to all of our teams, but we also need to look outside to our users. So keep that in mind as well. One more quote from Jeff. I'm not going to read it out to you, but the point is, just sort of going back to that, is that empathy isn't just about what's going on internally. You really have to pay attention to your users. Me as a DevOps evangelist, I actually work for our product team. So when I'm out meeting with people and they say, oh, I love this about your product, or I hate this about your product, I need to understand that and then take that back to our team and we iterate on that and make sure that we're listening to our users. So pay attention to that kind of stuff. That's pretty much it for me. Thank you for having me come out here and talk to you about DevOps. This is something I'm passionate about. Grab me in the hallway, and I'll be here all day long. So if you have any questions, and I think if we've got time for it, I don't know where Stephen or if we've got time. So if you have any questions, we can take care of that now. Otherwise, just grab me in the hall or grab me at lunch or whatever. So thank you very much. Oh, also, I'll put these slides up on Twitter, so those are available for you as well, so just look for that.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Don't be shy. Yes.
How do you, you're talking about measuring everything. How do you measure your organization's effectiveness as a DevOps, in the DevOps culture?
So just measuring the overall effectiveness of DevOps? Well, it's probably going to vary for your company in general, but you could start measuring things like how often are you deploying. So I can tell you, VictorOps, we deploy no less than once every 2 weeks. And a lot of that has become, we've started to automate different things, automating the building of our platforms, automating the testing of our code. And because of that, we're now able to actually release new versions of VictorOps every 2 weeks. So that's an easy one. That's low-hanging fruit, is just see how quickly are you releasing, and can you speed that up even just by a day. Other things you could be doing is, I know for me, I pay close attention to our interactions on chat. So I'm an administrator of our chat channel, so I get an email every week that tells me how many people have been chatting, how many of those are direct messages. I go over and I slap those people on the back of the wrist and say, those are messages that you just siloed, nobody else knows what you're talking about. Please put it back into the general room. So measuring things like that is another one. Does that help? Cool. Yeah, back here.
Yeah, so I've helped implement some DevOps cultures at a couple places, and one of the impediments that I run into a lot, and I'll give perspective on, was one of the biggest challenges is the ops culture, the classic ops culture, sees it as a loss of control, as more of the control moves into automation and developers getting involved in things that were classically their domain.
Yeah, and you're dead on right. I'm actually working on another presentation called "From No 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 to Go Go Go." The classic, operations people are like, no, that's their favorite word. No, you can't do that. That's my infrastructure. No, don't touch it. But that's just sort of the way things are moving now. So what happens is if we give our developers the ability to spin up, their own environment that really does not have much to do with production in the general sense. I think that's one way to sort of encourage them to understand how things work and understand the infrastructure in general. Even if it's something like Vagrant or Docker, just give them the ability to sort of provision that and manage that and understand that. You can move the needle a little bit towards that direction of giving them that control, or makes them feel as though they have some control because they are able to build up their own environments. And it's going to be based on maybe some sort of chef cookbook or whatever you've got set up. Like, this is what our environment needs to look like and that kind of thing. So I think, just sort of, you have to have trust for sure, right? And I think if you start to give them that ability to provision their own space to work and to develop in, that's really kind of step one, or at least going to help. Does that help?
Yeah, just interesting perspective.
Yeah, that's usually one of the first things that the operations teams say, and they have their first big concern with, especially if you're talking about allowing developers to build up big infrastructure that may cost them thousands of dollars a day. Do you really want to allow just anybody to willy-nilly go out and create infrastructure that may be costing the company money? So there's checks and balances I think you got to have in place for sure. And it's a discussion that just needs to be had with the entire team. How are we going to do this? How are we going to manage it and make sure we're doing it the right way? Any other questions? Cool. Well, thanks again. It's been a pleasure coming out here. This is the second time I've been to Phoenix in the past two months, so I'll say that there is quite a bit of technology that's exciting out here, and it's really cool to see DevOps really starting to take place out here, and hope to be back and talking more about it.